Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
My brother stole my wife. Yes, stole. And just when I thought things couldn't get worse, they sent me an invitation to their wedding. But I wasn't about to let them have the last laugh. I showed up with a surprise that left them, and everyone else, speechless. Looking back now, I wonder how I missed the signs. A year ago, my life felt normal, stable even. My wife, Emma, and I had been married for 5 years, and while we had our ups and downs, I never doubted her love for me. She was my rock, my best friend. And Tom? He wasn't just my brother. He was the guy I called when life felt too heavy. If someone had told me then that the two people I trusted most in the world would betray me in the worst possible way, I'd have laughed in their face. It started small, so small I didn't even notice at first. Emma began spending more time with Tom. They had always been friendly. Emma had a way of getting along with everyone, and Tom was no exception. He'd offered to help her with some work-related project, something about a presentation she was struggling with. I didn't think twice about it. In fact, I thought it was great that they got along so well. But then Emma started canceling plans with me. "I'm working late," she'd say. Or, "I'm too tired. Let's just do dinner another night." I brushed it off at first. Work can be exhausting, but the excuses piled up. The changes were subtle, but they added up. She was glued to her phone constantly, always tilting the screen away from me when I walked by. At first, I chalked it up to privacy. Everyone needs their space. But when I casually asked who she was texting, she got defensive. "Why are you so paranoid?" she snapped. Paranoid? I wasn't even accusing her of anything. But her tone set something off in me, a flicker of doubt I couldn't ignore. Then there were the nights she ran errands or went out with friends. She started coming home later and later, sometimes smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't mine. I asked her about it once, and she rolled her eyes. "You're imagining things," she said, laughing like it was absurd that I'd even ask. And Tom? He was quieter than usual, almost evasive. Whenever I brought Emma up, he'd change the subject or give me some vague, dismissive answer. I chalked it up to him being his usual self. Tom was never great at dealing with personal stuff, but something didn't sit right. The night everything fell apart started like any other. I was supposed to work late, but my project wrapped up early, so I decided to surprise Emma with takeout from her favorite restaurant. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Tom's car parked in front of the house. My heart sank, though I couldn't explain why. It wasn't unusual for Tom to stop by. He had a key and sometimes dropped off things he borrowed. But something about the sight of his car made my stomach churn. I stepped inside, the bag of food still warm in my hand. The house was quiet, too quiet. I called out, "Emma? Tom?" But there was no response. And then I heard it, muffled voices coming from upstairs. I moved slowly, my heart pounding in my chest as I climbed the stairs. Part of me wanted to stop, to turn around and leave before I saw something I couldn't unsee. But I kept going, my feet carrying me to our bedroom door. It was cracked open just enough for me to see them. They were sitting on the edge of the bed, close enough that their shoulders touched. Emma was laughing at something Tom had said. Her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. He leaned in, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and she didn't pull away. I froze. It was like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. This was my wife, my brother, in my house. They must have felt me there, because they both turned to look at the door. The look on their faces said it all. Shock, guilt, and worst of all, no denial. "My name," Emma started, her voice trembling. But she didn't finish. She didn't need to. Tom stood up, his hands raised like he was surrendering. "This isn't what it looks like," he said, but the words felt empty. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just stood there staring at them, until finally I dropped the bag of food and walked out. As I got in my car and drove away, my mind was a blur of emotions. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do. All I knew was that everything I thought I knew about my life had just crumbled in front of me. The days after that night were a complete blur. Sleep was impossible. Food? Forget it. The betrayal had taken up residence in my chest, a dull, constant ache that made it hard to breathe. It felt like my entire world had collapsed, and I didn't know how to piece it back together. Emma barely looked at me when she came back to the house to pack her things. It was almost robotic, the way she moved through the rooms, grabbing her clothes, her books, the photos we'd taken together over the years. I tried to talk to her, to get her to stop and think about what she was doing. "Emma, please," I said, blocking her path as she carried a box to the door. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "We can fix this. Whatever's going on, we can figure it out. Just don't do this." She didn't meet my eyes. It's already done, she said quietly, her voice flat. I watched as she loaded her things into Tom's car. Of course, he was there, standing by the driver's side like some twisted knight in shining armor. He didn't say a word to me, didn't even look in my direction. It was like I didn't exist. When Emma closed the trunk, she turned to me one last time. I'm sorry, she said, but her words were hollow, more out of obligation than sincerity. Then she climbed into the passenger seat, and just like that, she was gone. I stood in the driveway long after the car disappeared down the street. The house felt empty in a way I couldn't describe. It wasn't just Emma's absence. It was the silence that came with it, the weight of knowing she'd chosen my brother over me. I couldn't bring myself to confront Tom. Every time I thought about calling him, about demanding answers, my chest tightened. How do you even begin to have that conversation? What could he possibly say that would make any of this better? But the silence between us only made things worse. He didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't even attempt to explain himself. It was like he'd cut me out of his life the moment he'd stolen mine. My parents were no help either. When I told them what had happened, they were horrified, but not in the way I'd hoped. Instead of rallying behind me, they tried to play the neutrality card. We don't want to take sides, my mom said gently, as if that was supposed to make me feel better. Tom's still your brother, and Emma, well, these things happen. These things happen? I repeated, my voice rising. This isn't some petty argument, Mom. He stole my wife. My dad, always the peacemaker, chimed in. Look, son, we're not saying what they did was right, but they're still family. Holding on to anger won't help anyone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could they be so calm about this? I wanted to scream, to make them understand the depth of my pain. But instead, I just nodded numbly and left. At home, the silence was unbearable. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of Emma. Her favorite mug in the kitchen, the blanket she always curled up with on the couch, the framed photo from our honeymoon that I couldn't bring myself to take down. It was like she was still there, haunting the life we'd built together. I tried to focus on work, but it was useless. My mind kept drifting back to the betrayal, replaying that night over and over again. The look on their faces, the way they didn't even try to deny it, it was burned into my memory. I started questioning everything. Had our entire marriage been a lie? Were there signs I'd missed, moments where I could have stopped this from happening? The self-doubt was suffocating. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift. The pain didn't go away, but it started to harden into something else. Anger. Not the blinding, impulsive kind, but a slow, simmering rage that made me want to take control of my life again. They had taken so much from me, my marriage, my trust, my sense of stability. But I wasn't going to let them take everything. I didn't know what my next step would be, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. By the time the invitation arrived, I was beginning to feel like I could breathe again. The worst of the storm had passed, or so I thought. In the months after Emma left, I threw myself into rebuilding what was left of my life. I started therapy, which helped more than I ever thought it would. My therapist was the first person to tell me that my pain was valid, that it wasn't something I had to bury under excuses or force forgiveness. I also started going out more, reconnecting with friends I'd unintentionally distanced myself from during my marriage. They rallied around me, their support a lifeline in those early days. But the void Emma left was still there. Some nights, I'd sit in my living room, staring at the empty side of the couch where she used to curl up. It wasn't just her absence that hurt. It was the way she'd left, the cruelty of her choosing Tom, and the way neither of them seemed to feel any remorse. So when I opened my mailbox one crisp autumn afternoon and found an ornate envelope addressed to me in swirling gold lettering, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The envelope was heavy, like the kind you'd expect to hold a prestigious award or an invitation to some exclusive gala. My name was printed on the front in a font so elegant it almost mocked me. For a split second, I thought it might be a belated apology letter from one of them. But when I opened it and saw the words, "You're cordially invited," followed by Tom and Emma's names, my entire body went cold. My hands trembled as I read the rest. The date was set for December, a winter wedding, complete with a reception at some upscale venue I'd never heard of. They'd gone all out, RSVP cards, a map of the venue, and even a personalized note at the bottom. We hope you can join us to celebrate this special day. Family means the world to us, and we wouldn't want it any other way. I stared at the words, feeling like someone had punched me in the gut. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Why would they invite me? They had to know how cruel this was, right? Was this some kind of sick joke? Or worse, was it genuine? I paced my living room, the invitation clutched in my hand. Maybe they were trying to paint themselves as the bigger people, the kind who could rise above the messiness of what had happened. Maybe they wanted to ease their own guilt by pretending everything was fine. Or maybe, deep down, they were just that delusional. The audacity of it hit me in waves. They'd not only destroyed my marriage and my relationship with my brother, but now they wanted me to stand there and watch them celebrate it? My anger boiled over, and before I could stop myself, I crumpled the invitation into a tight ball and threw it across the room. But the anger didn't last long. As I sat down and stared at the crumpled envelope, something darker crept in. Curiosity. Why had they invited me? Did they really think I'd come? And if I did, what would I even do? The idea of sitting quietly in the crowd, pretending to smile as they exchanged vows, made my skin crawl. But the idea of not going at all, of letting them erase me from their narrative, felt just as unbearable. I picked up the crumpled invitation, smoothing it out as best I could. The gold lettering seemed to gleam mockingly under the light. If they wanted me to come, fine, I'd go. But I wasn't going to let them have their perfect, drama-free day. A small, bitter smile tugged at the corners of my mouth as a plan began to form in the back of my mind. They wanted me there? They'd get me, but I wouldn't come empty-handed. In the days that followed, I started piecing together what I'd bring to the wedding. I wasn't sure exactly what my surprise would be yet, but I knew one thing. It wasn't going to be a gift they'd forget anytime soon. This wasn't about revenge, not entirely, anyway. It was about making a statement, about showing them and everyone else in that room that I wasn't just some footnote in their love story. I'd been the one betrayed, the one left to pick up the pieces, and if they thought they could sweep that under the rug with some fancy wedding invitations and forced smiles, they were dead wrong. I RSVP'd yes the next day. When I first opened that wedding invitation, the answer seemed obvious. No. There was no way I was going to stand there and watch my brother marry the woman who had once vowed to spend her life with me. The thought alone was unbearable. So I tore the invitation in half and tossed it in the trash. Problem solved, or so I thought. But over the next few days, the invitation haunted me. No matter how hard I tried to push it out of my mind, it kept creeping back in, gnawing at me. The audacity of it all. They'd stolen my life, my happiness, and now they wanted me to quietly fade into the background while they tied the knot. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Emma had been my wife, and Tom had been my brother. These weren't just two random people who had wronged me. They were supposed to be the people I could trust most in the world. And instead of apologizing or even acknowledging the damage they'd done, they decided to throw a big, extravagant wedding, as if nothing had happened. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung. It was the sheer lack of accountability. They were moving on with their lives like I didn't matter, like I hadn't been a crucial part of the story they were now rewriting to suit themselves. Why should they get a walk away unscathed? Why should they get their fairy tale ending when they'd left me with nothing but heartbreak? That's when my anger began to shift into something else, resolve. I started to see the invitation not as an insult, but as an opportunity. If they wanted me there, fine. I'd show up. But I wasn't going to celebrate their union or pretend that everything was okay. No, I was going to remind them of what they'd done, of the mess they'd created and the lives they'd shattered to be together. I wasn't entirely sure what I'd do yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't let them have their perfect day without a hitch. I dug the torn invitation out of the trash and pieced it back together, smoothing out the creases as best I could. Staring at those golden letters, an idea started to form in the back of my mind. This wasn't going to be some petty act of revenge. I didn't want to ruin their lives or cause a scene just for the sake of it. No, I wanted something bigger, something meaningful. I wanted to make a statement to show them, and everyone else in that room, exactly what kind of people they were. But to pull it off, I need a plan. I spent the next few days brainstorming ideas, my mind racing with possibilities. Should I give a speech? Expose them in front of all their friends and family? Maybe I could even bring a guest of my own, someone who'd make them squirm. The options were endless, but I knew whatever I chose had to be calculated and precise. This wasn't just about making them uncomfortable. It was about reclaiming my power. They'd taken so much from me, and for too long, I'd let them dictate the narrative. But not anymore. When I RSVP'd yes, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. It was like taking the first step on a path I hadn't known I needed to walk. As the weeks went by and the wedding date drew closer, I started putting the pieces of my plan into place. I couldn't stop imagining the look on their faces when they realized I wasn't the pushover they thought I was. They wanted me there, and now they were going to get me on my terms. Once I decided I was going to the wedding, the real work began. This wasn't just about showing up and sitting in the back. stewing in anger while they pretended everything was fine. No, this was about taking control of the narrative they'd stolen from me. At first, my ideas were chaotic and scattered. My anger made me imagine petty, vindictive moves, standing up in the middle of the ceremony to object, spilling a drink on Emma's dress, or shouting their dirty laundry to the crowd. But deep down, I knew none of that would satisfy me. It wouldn't make them understand the depth of their betrayal, and it certainly wouldn't make me feel whole again. I didn't want revenge for revenge's sake. What I wanted was to make them face the truth, publicly, undeniably. I wanted them to realize they couldn't sweep their actions under the rug and move on as if I didn't exist. The first step was assembling a team. I reached out to a few old friends who had known both me and Tom growing up. Most of them had distanced themselves from him over the years. His ego and constant need for attention had a way of pushing people away. When I told them what had happened, their reactions ranged from disbelief to outright anger on my behalf. "Are you kidding me?" my friend Mark said, his voice practically shaking over the phone. "Tom did that to you? And she went along with it? Unbelievable." Mark wasn't the only one who was furious. By the end of the week, I had a small group of allies who were more than willing to help me pull off my plan. They didn't just sympathize. They genuinely wanted to see Tom and Emma squirm. Together, we brainstormed ideas late into the night, bouncing concepts off each other over beers and takeout. Some were too over the top, others too subtle, but eventually we landed on something that felt perfect, a multimedia display of truth. I dug into my files, searching for anything that would help drive the point home. Emails, photos, old messages. Anything that showed the depth of my connection to Emma and the trust Tom had shattered. It was an emotional minefield, revisiting memories that once brought me joy, but now only brought pain. And then I stumbled across something I'd almost forgotten about, a video Emma and I had made on our 5th wedding anniversary. We'd set up the camera on the dining room table, laughing as we tried to get the angle just right. The video was meant to be a time capsule, a way to remind ourselves years down the line of how much we loved each other. In it, Emma smiled into the camera, her eyes sparkling as she talked about our future. "You're my best friend, my partner, my everything," she said in the video, her voice steady and full of conviction. "I can't wait to see what our life looks like 5, 10, 50 years from now." Watching it now felt like a punch to the gut. Every word was a lie. Every smile, a cruel reminder of what had been taken from me. But it also gave me an idea. What better way to remind them of the life they destroyed than to use Emma's own words? The video wasn't just a relic of our past. It was a mirror, one that would force her to confront what she'd said, what she'd promised, and how easily she'd thrown it all away. I shared the video with my friends, explaining my plan to play it during the reception. Their reactions were immediate and enthusiastic. "This is perfect," Mark said, grinning. "It's not just petty, it's powerful." They can't argue with it because it's her own words. From there, the plan started to come together. We'd create a seamless presentation that included the video, along with other bits of evidence. Photos of Emma and me together, text messages from Tom and Emma that hinted at their betrayal, and even candid moments from our shared lives. The goal wasn't to humiliate them. It was to make them face the truth, to show the world who they really were. As the wedding day approached, I finalized every detail. I rented a projector and a portable screen, ensuring I could set up quickly and without drawing too much attention. I rehearsed my speech in front of the mirror, refining the words until they felt just right, calm, measured, and impossible to dismiss. In the quiet moments, doubt crept in. Was I going too far? Would this make me look petty or vindictive? But every time those thoughts surfaced, I reminded myself of one simple truth. They had taken everything from me. This wasn't about stooping to their level. This was about standing up for myself in a way I never had before. By the time I finished the final preparations, I felt ready. Whatever happened on that day, one thing was certain. It would be a wedding no one would forget. The day of the wedding arrived, and with it came a storm of emotions I wasn't entirely prepared for. I woke up early, staring at the ceiling as the enormity of what I was about to do settled over me. Was this the right choice? Could I really go through with it? My mind wrestled with doubts, but every time I pictured Tom and Emma standing there, acting like their betrayal was some beautiful love story, I felt my resolve harden. I pulled on my best suit, one Emma had picked out for me years ago. I told myself it wasn't symbolic, but deep down I knew it was. I wanted her to see me, to remember the life we'd built and the man she'd left behind. With everything in place, the video, the projector, the speech rehearsed in my mind, I grabbed my keys and drove to the venue. The wedding was being held at an upscale country club on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place Emma used to talk about wistfully back when we were dreaming about our own future. As I pulled into the parking lot, I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Inside, the atmosphere was exactly what I'd expected. Elegant but soulless, all white linens and polished silverware. The guests were milling about, chatting and sipping champagne, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. I walked in like I belonged there, my head held high and my chest tight with anticipation. No one stopped me. In fact, a few people even nodded in recognition. Family, friends, and distant relatives who probably assumed everything was fine between me and Tom. It was surreal, being in the middle of all this joy and celebration while carrying the weight of what I was about to do. And then I saw them. Tom and Emma were standing near the entrance to the ceremony hall, greeting guests with forced smiles and empty pleasantries. When their eyes landed on me, the air between us seemed to shift. For a split second, I saw a shock flicker across their faces, quickly replaced by awkward smiles. "Glad you could make it," Tom said, his voice tight, his hand gripping a glass of champagne just a little too hard. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied evenly, holding his gaze. Emma didn't say anything. She just looked away, her cheeks flushed, and busied herself straightening her dress. It was the first time I'd seen her since she walked out of my life, and the sight of her standing there, radiant in her wedding gown, made my stomach churn. The ceremony began soon after, and I took my seat near the back, deliberately choosing a spot where I had a clear view of everything. My heart pounded as the music started, and Emma walked down the aisle, her arm linked with my father's. Yes, my father. The same man who had told me to let it go, who had refused to take sides in the aftermath of their betrayal. Watching him beam with pride as he handed her over to Tom was almost too much to bear. As the officiant began the ceremony, I felt a strange detachment settle over me, like I was watching a scene from a movie rather than something happening in real life. Tom and Emma stood at the altar, exchanging loving glances and whispered words, as if they hadn't left a trail of destruction to get here. When they started their vows, I had to clench my fist to keep from laughing out loud. Emma spoke first, her voice soft and trembling as she promised to love, honor, and cherish Tom for better or for worse. The same words she'd once said to me, now recycled for my brother. Tom followed with his own vows, full of flowery declarations about loyalty and devotion. Words that rang hollow coming from someone who had betrayed his own flesh and blood. By the time the ceremony ended, my heart was racing. The guests erupted into applause as Tom kissed Emma, sealing their union with a dramatic flourish. I clapped along, but the smile on my face wasn't one of joy, it was one of anticipation. As everyone filed into the reception hall for dinner and dancing, I hung back, mentally rehearsing my next move. The time for second-guessing was over. They had no idea what was coming. The reception was as extravagant as the ceremony had been, if not more so. The room was decked out with glittering chandeliers, elegant centerpieces, and enough white roses to make a florist's head spin. A live band played soft jazz as the guests mingled and sipped champagne. It was a picture-perfect celebration, the kind of event you'd expect to see in a magazine. I kept a low profile at first, blending into the crowd as much as possible. It wasn't hard. Everyone was too busy admiring the decor, complimenting Emma's dress, or fawning over Tom's charm. But I wasn't there to be part of the background. I had a purpose, and as the evening wore on, my anticipation only grew. The meal was served, a 4-course extravaganza that tasted as pretentious as it looked. I poked at my plate, barely registering the food. My mind was too focused on what was coming next. When the speeches began, I listened in silence, my hands gripping the edge of the table. Emma's maid of honor gave a tearful toast about how Tom and Emma were meant to be, a phrase that made my stomach turn. Tom's best man, a mutual friend who'd conveniently forgotten I existed, followed up with a string of jokes about Tom's commitment issues before declaring Emma the one who'd finally tamed him. The room erupted in laughter and cheers, and I forced a tight smile, my blood boiling beneath the surface. Then came Tom's turn to speak. He stood up, flashing his trademark grin, and thanked everyone for coming. He talked about how lucky he was to have found Emma, how she was his soulmate, his best friend, the love of his life. His words dripped with sincerity, but to me, they felt like poison. Emma followed with her own speech, her voice trembling with emotion as she talked about how Tom had been her rock through tough times. She glanced at him with adoration, as if he hadn't been the one to break the foundation of her last marriage. The applause that followed was deafening, but it only made the knot in my stomach tighten. That was my cue. I stood up slowly, tapping my glass with a spoon to get everyone's attention. The soft chime rang out over the murmurs, and the room gradually fell silent as all eyes turned to me. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm but loud enough to carry. "I'd like to say a few words." The guests exchanged curious glances, clearly surprised. Tom and Emma froze, their smiles faltering as they turned to look at me. Emma's face turned pale, and Tom's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, as if to interrupt, but stopped himself. "Go ahead," he said, finally, his voice tight. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me. This was it, the culmination of weeks of planning, of sleepless nights, and countless rehearsals in front of the mirror. I wasn't planning to speak tonight. I began, my tone measured. But as I sat here listening to all the wonderful things being said about Tom and Emma, I realized there was something missing from the story. A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. Tom shifted in his seat, his hand tightening around Emma's. She avoided my gaze, staring down at the table as if willing it to swallow her whole. "I've known Tom and Emma for years," I continued, locking eyes with the crowd. "In fact, I've known them better than most. Emma and I were married for 5 years. 5 wonderful, complicated, beautiful years." Gasps erupted around the room, and I saw heads turning as whispers spread like wildfire. "But as some of you might already know," I said, pausing to let the weight of my words sink in, "that marriage came to an end. And while I can't say it was easy, I've come to accept it. People change, relationships evolve, and sometimes life takes unexpected turns." I turned my gaze to Tom, whose face was a mask of barely concealed anger. "What I can't accept, however," I said, my voice hardening, "is betrayal. The kind of betrayal that comes from those you trust most." The room was dead silent now, every pair of eyes glued to me. I could feel the tension radiating off Tom and Emma, but I pressed on. "Tom," I said, addressing him directly, "I want to thank you for showing me what true loyalty looks like. I trusted you. I confided in you, and you repaid me by taking what wasn't yours. You taught me a lesson I'll never forget." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, holding it up for everyone to see. "But I didn't come here to just talk. I'd like to share something that I think captures the essence of tonight's celebration." With that, I connected my phone to the projector, which I discreetly set up earlier. The screen lit up, and the video began to play. The room buzzed with uneasy murmurs as the projector screen flickered to life. My heart was pounding, but I kept my face calm, my expression neutral. I raised my glass as if to make a toast, forcing a smile that I knew didn't reach my eyes. "First, I want to congratulate the happy couple," I said, my voice steady but laced with unmistakable tension. "Tom and Emma, you've truly outdone yourselves. This is quite the celebration." A few guests chuckled nervously, their unease palpable. I let the silence stretch for a beat longer than was comfortable, then continued, "I know tonight is all about love, loyalty, and new beginnings. And in that spirit, I wanted to share something special. A little piece of the journey that brought us here today." I tapped my phone, and the projector sprang to life. The screen glowed brightly, casting a stark light over the room as the video began to play. The opening shot was simple. Emma and me sitting on the couch in our old apartment, the one we'd moved into right after our honeymoon. She was radiant, her eyes sparkling with the kind of joy I hadn't seen in a long time. "It's our 5th anniversary." Emma's voice rang out, light and full of laughter. In the video, she leaned into me, her hand resting on my chest. "I just want to say how much I love you. My name? These 5 years have been the best of my life." Gasps rippled through the room. I didn't look at the crowd. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, letting the moment play out. In the video, Emma continued, her smile widening as she spoke. "I can't wait to see what the future holds for us. You're my best friend, my partner, my everything. I love you more than words can say." The words hung in the air like a dagger. I glanced at the crowd. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some whispering furiously to one another. Tom's face was a deep shade of red, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. Emma, on the other hand, looked like she was about to pass out. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. I let the video run for a few seconds longer before pausing it. The screen froze on a shot of Emma laughing, her head tilted back in unguarded happiness. I turned to face the room, lowering my glass but keeping my voice steady. "I just thought everyone should see how much love this family shares," I said, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "It's truly inspiring, isn't it? Tom finally broke the silence, slamming his hand down on the table. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with barely restrained rage. "This?" I said, feigning innocence. "Oh, it's just a little trip down memory lane. I thought it might add some perspective to tonight's festivities." Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "Turn it off," she said, her eyes wide with panic. "Please, just turn it off." I ignored her, gesturing back to the screen. "You see, Emma and I shared something real once. Something worth celebrating. But somewhere along the way, Tom decided he wanted it for himself. And Emma? Well, I guess she decided it was easier to trade up than to keep her promises." The room erupted into chaos. Guests shouted over one another, demanding answers. Some were clearly appalled. Others seemed too stunned to react. My parents, who had been sitting in the front row, looked mortified. My mother's hand was pressed to her mouth, her eyes darting between me, Tom, and Emma. My father looked furious, but whether his anger was directed at me or at the situation, I couldn't tell. Tom stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You've made your point," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "Now get out." But I wasn't finished. "Oh, I'm just getting started," I said, meeting his glare head-on. "You invited me here, remember? You wanted me to celebrate your love story. Well, here I am, celebrating." Emma finally broke down, tears streaming down her face as she buried her head in her hands. "Why are you doing this?" she sobbed. "Why?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Because you both decided my life, my marriage, was disposable. You tore it apart, and you didn't even have the decency to own up to it. And now you want to play happy family? Not on my watch." The crowd's energy shifted from shock to discomfort. People began whispering among themselves, some sneaking glances at the exits, as if they were debating whether to leave. "I think we're done here," Tom said, his voice cold as he grabbed Emma's arm and started to lead her away from the table. "Done?" I called after him, my voice cutting through the noise. "You don't get to decide when this ends, Tom. You made your bed. Now lie in it." I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, the eyes of every guest boring into my back as I stood there. Part of me wondered if I'd gone too far, but another part, the part that had been silenced for so long, felt strangely liberated. As Tom and Emma disappeared into the back of the venue, I turned to the crowd, raising my glass one last time. "To honesty," I said simply. Then I walked out. The aftermath of my reveal was nothing short of chaos. The once celebratory atmosphere of the wedding had turned tense and volatile. Guests whispered furiously to one another, their conversations punctuated by sharp gasps and scandalized expressions. A few people even stood up and quietly made their way to the exits, unable or unwilling to bear witness to the disaster unfolding before them. Tom wasted no time storming toward me, his face contorted with rage. The charming grin he'd worn all evening was gone, replaced by a mask of barely controlled fury. He stopped inches from me, his finger jabbing the air like a weapon. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, his voice loud enough to silence the murmuring crowd. I didn't flinch. I'd anticipated this reaction, even prepared for it. "What's wrong with me?" I shot back, my voice steady but sharp. "What's wrong with you? You think you can steal my wife, invite me to your wedding, and act like nothing happened? Consider this my RSVP." The room fell silent, save for the hum of the projector still displaying the frozen image of Emma from the video. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Emma, who had been sitting frozen at the table, suddenly burst into tears. Her sobs were loud and raw, echoing through the room. She stood up so abruptly that her chair tipped over and clattered to the floor. Covering her face with her hands, she fled toward the back of the venue, her white dress swishing behind her like a ghost disappearing into the night. My parents, who had been seated near the front, exchanged panicked glances before rushing toward me. My mom reached me first, her face pale with a mixture of anger and desperation. "My name," she said, grabbing my arm, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this? This isn't the time or place." "Really, Mom?" I said, pulling my arm free. "And what was the right time? When they were sneaking around behind my back? Or when you decided to sit on the sidelines and pretend none of this was happening?" She recoiled as if I'd slapped her, tears welling up in her eyes. My dad stepped in then, his voice stern and low. "That's enough, son. You've made your point. Now leave before you make this worse." I turned to face him, my chest tight with frustration. "Worse? Dad, they destroyed my marriage. My life. And you're worried about me making it worse? Unbelievable." Tom, who had been pacing furiously nearby, finally exploded. You think of the victim here, he shouted, his voice cracking. Grow up, my name. Your marriage was falling apart long before Emma and I. Don't you dare try to justify this, I interrupted, my voice cutting through as like a whip. You're my brother. You should have been the one person I could trust. And Emma, she stood in front of me and promised me forever. You both threw that away like it meant nothing. So no, Tom, I don't think I'm the one who needs to grow up. The guests, who had been watching in stunned silence, began to murmur again. I caught snippets of their conversations. Words like shameful, disgusting, and unbelievable floated through the air. Emma didn't return, and Tom's attempts to regain control of the situation were futile. He tried to address the crowd, his voice shaky as he muttered something about misunderstandings and family drama. But no one was buying it. The damage was done. Mark, one of my closest friends who'd helped me plan the reveal, approached me as I made my way toward the exit. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, his grin equal parts amused and impressed. You really did it, huh? He said, shaking his head. I nodded, exhaling a shaky breath. I wasn't sure I could, but yeah, I did. You've got guts, man, he said, lowering his voice. That was brutal, but they deserved every second of it. By the time I stepped outside, the cool night air felt like a relief against my flushed skin. I stood by my car for a moment, taking it all in. Inside, I could still hear the muffled sounds of raised voices and hurried footsteps as the fallout continued to ripple through the crowd. A part of me felt vindicated, like I'd finally taken back some of the power they'd stolen from me. But another part of me, quieter, deeper, felt heavy with the weight of what I'd just done. There was no going back now. The bridge had been burned, and the damage was irreparable. But maybe that was the point. As I drove away, the venue fading in my rearview mirror, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. But one thing was certain, they would never forget this day. After the wedding, silence fell like a curtain over the whole situation. I didn't hear from Tom or Emma again, and I didn't expect to. They had made their choice, and I had made mine. The distance between us wasn't just physical, it was absolute. The days that followed were strangely quiet. No angry texts, no late-night phone calls, not even a passive-aggressive email from my parents. At first, I thought it was the calm before another storm, but as the days turned into weeks, I realized they had chosen silence. Maybe they were too embarrassed to confront me. Maybe they were too angry. Either way, I welcomed it. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The weight of their betrayal was still there, but it didn't suffocate me anymore. I confronted them, stood my ground, and walked away with my dignity intact. That, more than anything, felt like victory. I poured myself into rebuilding my life. My house, which had felt so empty after Emma left, became a sanctuary. I redecorated, swapping out the furniture and decorations that reminded me of her for things that were entirely mine. The wedding photo that had once hung in the hallway? Gone. The keepsakes from our honeymoon? Donated. It was cathartic, turning the space into something that reflected who I was now, not who I used to be. I also leaned heavily on my friends during this time. They rallied around me in ways I hadn't expected, pulling me out of my isolation and reminding me of the person I'd been before Emma and Tom turned my life upside down. Mark especially became a constant presence, dragging me out to concerts, game nights, and even a few blind dates. At first, it was awkward trying to re-enter the world of dating. I carried so much baggage, so many insecurities about trust and loyalty. But with time, I learned to let go of the bitterness and focus on the possibilities ahead. I wasn't looking for another Emma. I was looking for someone new, someone who would meet me where I was, scars and all. My parents predictably tried to sweep everything under the rug. A month after the wedding, my mom called me, her voice hesitant. We haven't heard from Tom, she said. He and Emma are keeping to themselves. Not my problem, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She sighed. Don't you think it's time to put this behind you? You've made your point, and what's done is done. Exactly, I said. What's done is done. That's why I'm moving forward. Without them, my dad tried his own approach a week later, sending me an email about family unity and the importance of forgiveness. I read it once, then deleted it. I wasn't interested in lectures about unity from a man who had stayed silent when I needed him most. But as much as I was tempted to write my family off completely, I realized I didn't need to make any sweeping declarations. Distance was enough. Over time, the space between us grew wider, not because of any grand falling out, but because I stopped trying to bridge the gap. Every now and then, I'd hear snippets about Tom and Emma through mutual acquaintances. They'd moved to a new city, started fresh. It didn't bother me as much as I thought it would. If anything, I was grateful. They were out of sight, out of mind. For me, moving forward wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about refusing to let it define me. The wedding wasn't a happy memory, but it was a turning point. It was the moment I stopped being a victim and started taking control of my story. Now, my life feels like mine again. I've started new hobbies, built new relationships, and even taken a few risks I never would have considered before. There's something freeing about hitting rock bottom and realizing you can build anything you want from the rubble. Standing up for myself wasn't easy, and it didn't erase the pain of what they did. But it gave me something even more valuable: closure. Tom and Emma will always be a part of my story, but they're not the main characters anymore. They're footnotes, reminders of a time when I let others dictate my worth. And now, I'm writing a new chapter, one where I'm the hero of my own story.